Welcome everyone, and welcome Kristian and Anders. Kristian Rönn, who's the author of the Darwinian Trap, I interviewed last year, and he's also the CEO and co-founder of Normative, and Anders Sandberg is the author of the upcoming book Grand Futures, and an academic jack of all trades, futurist and then transhumanist as well. But both have worked at the Future of Humanity Institute, and both are also Swedish. So yes, it's really warm at my side of the world, so I imagine it's extremely cold in yours at the moment. So it's a real pleasure to have you both on to discuss the Darwinian Trap, which I really believe to be an important subject. It's a great book, great read. I recommend everybody giving it a go. So just to kick things off, what got you interested in this particular subject, or what inspired you to read the book, in your case, Anders?
Well, I ran into Kristian actually, literally at a birthday party of a mutual friend, and he handed over a manuscript and said, you better read this. And, well, it was definitely worth reading.
I'm very glad that you ended up reading it, and I also want to say to everyone listening, Anders has been such a huge inspiration of mine, and working with you and Nick and Toby and all of the other people at the Future of Humanity Institute shaped so much of my own thinking. So I think there is not just a little bit of you in the book, but actually a lot.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting thing also, because that take on using evolution both as a metaphor but also as an actually real thing that is going on, and trying to see how does that act as a foundation for stuff going on in the world, including stuff that goes badly wrong. That is something I think I've been doing since I was a teenager. I remember coming across a column in Scientific American about the Iterated prisoner's dilemma and running evolutionary tournaments, and that early work really blew my mind. It got me to realize that, wow, there is an evolution of cooperation going on. And when I looked around at society, I realized, oh, this has political consequences. Oh dear, I'd better get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, and it actually reminds me a little bit how this was the case for me as well. I started to play around with evolutionary simulations from an early age, especially sort of predator-prey dynamics and population dynamics, and just sort of discovered that, okay, these systems are not necessarily super stable. So I think I've had some similar sort of childhood experiences that had an influence on the book as well.
I think it's quite common that people start out by the assumption that nature must be eternal and stable. So there are these ideas about the harmony of nature or the balance of nature. And once you take an evolutionary perspective, the next idea is, okay, no, stuff gets optimized. So again, you can try to save your view of nature and assume that everything has been optimized for its place and everything is finely tuned for that. But now we can explain it with evolution. And that, of course, forgets the main part of evolution. It's one darn thing after another. It's trial and error, or rather, quite often trial and terror, because you have species dying, individuals dying. A lot of horrible things happen, and some species succeed just because of dumb luck. But in the end, you get this dynamic system that generates tremendous diversity and interesting adaptation. But it's a dynamic situation. It's not that static, pleasant meadow, but it's a wild world.
Exactly. And I think one way that I like to sort of frame it is that, evolution through natural selection, as you said, it is like a trial and error optimization algorithm. You could almost see it as this random walk throughout the fitness landscape, and at any given point it's not like evolution can predict what is on the other side or what will happen. It can just sort of sense the gradient of the fitness. Should we move upwards here or not? And it might be like a suboptimal hill, and you get stuck on that hill and eventually die because the landscape sort of change around you. So it's a very sort of dynamic and changing thing that doesn't look like 1,000 generations in the future. It's incapable of doing that. It can literally just say, okay, this thing right here, this mutation is adaptive in the short run, but what is adaptive in the short run might actually end up killing you in the long run.
It's a bit like some weird problems in evolution, like why do snail shells all turn to the right? And the answer is it's not strictly true. You find snail shells that actually are sinistral, that turn to the left. They're relatively rare, so collectors of course find them very fun. There are also a few species that actually have naturally sinistral shells. But the really cool part is that if you look over the evolutionary tree of mollusks, you find that sinistral shells show up here and there and then go extinct at a higher rate than the right-handed shells. No idea why. I don't think anybody actually has a good explanation ever, although there is some idea about right-handed crabs and things like that. So you have this constant attempt, and it seems like a good idea. After all, it seems to be neutral, but something is bad about having a left turning shell.
I don't know what that is. I've got no idea. Is it the way
Well,
the
if you
Earth
look at a
spins?
seashell, you will find that if you hold it up, so you have an opening towards you and the top, you will find that it turns to the right, not to the left. For most species and most
So
individuals.
essentially like the spiral, like whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise, more or less.
Yeah.
Is this going back, like, did they notice the same thing very early in evolution, like just after the Cambrian explosion?
I think, I think this has been going on for a very long time. I don't know how it is with the ammonites, the other kind of fossil that also have spiral shells. I'm not much into ammonite shells. I used to collect seashells when I was a kid, so I know a little bit too much about them, but it wouldn't surprise me that ammonites are doing something completely different. Maybe the dynamics is a different thing. So one of the funny things about evolution is, on one hand, it creates this tremendous diversity. It tries everything, it finds new niches, but you also get a lot of convergence. If you have a swimming creature, it's a good idea to have a relatively bright stomach and a dark back, because that means predators below you see you against the bright surface of the water, and predators above you see you against the darkness below. So hence tuna and the penguins are all kind of converging in this direction. And that's also why the patterning of pleistiosaurs, when people draw dinosaurs in the sea, usually assume they had the same pattern. I don't think it has been proven, but it's a pretty solid guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, what are some... evolution doesn't have foresight, as you were just mentioning, at least in the long term or the medium term. It doesn't really have a model of the world as far as I understand, right? It's not like a cohesive intelligence. It seeks short-term rewards. Anything that's successful in the short term is selected for. It can't really see over a long time period. So how does that really translate into what we see as like, toxic workplace situations or inability to coordinate on climate change or AI risk or things like that?
Yeah, so I think it is sort of both a useful metaphor and a good explanation for our short-sightedness. And I mean, of course, like, you can still have long-term phenomena in evolution. I mean, the fact that we sort of have a brain that can predict the future is sort of, evolution's way of avoiding some of the problems of non-predictability in a sense, because it means that we can sort of, move throughout the landscape much better and making us more fit overall. But nonetheless, it's sort of easy to fall for those short-term traps. And you mentioned the workplace, for instance, like one way where sort of natural selection in a way can sort of make things complicated. I mean, you could say that, you know, there is some sort of selection function for who is getting promoted and who is not getting promoted, and then obviously, like, if, you know, the selection criteria for getting promoted is a bad proxy for performance, and there's ways to sort of game that metric, whatever it is, it will be sort of an adaptive behavior, and it could be anything from, you know, just sucking up to the boss, or it could be like nagging in general. But also you have sort of, I don't know, larger problems related to workplaces that are somewhat, you know, grounded in evolution. I mean, it can be anything from I don't know, like wage policies, or like, I mean, looking at you know, the past where it was completely allowed to have like small children sweeping the chimneys. I mean, it would be cheaper to have child laborers. They could be, you know, great because they fit better into the chimney or something like that. And then obviously a company that sort of pays less and have higher profits will be sort of more competitive in the long run, unless there is, you know, some sort of moral outrage or backlash, which I guess was the case, and we sort of solved that dilemma through regulation, essentially saying that, you know, you're not allowed to have, you know, children sweeping chimneys anymore.
And quite often you get these races that push a system towards a more fragile state. So Kristian has some examples from paleontology where there are several cases where there are predators and prey, like on a savanna, and the predators, they're very effective. So the prey that manage to avoid the predator survive better, which might involve growing bigger, so they're harder to attack. But then predators that are bigger get an advantage, so they grow bigger. And gradually you get this ratchet of bigger prey, bigger predators, until one day you get a situation where a little bit of a climate change or a volcanic eruption, suddenly the predators go extinct. And then the cycle starts repeating with some other predator realizing this is an empty niche and starting to evolve like that. And of course you can get the same thing on a market. If you're thinking as an insurance company, you get a customer. You calculate the probability that the customer is going to need money, and then you want to add on to that, on top of it, a premium, so you make some money. And of course, if there is a more risky and uncertain case, you want to add on a much bigger premium. But that alpha, how much you add on, the smaller the alpha is, the lower the premium is, and now the customer is going to be happy and tell his friends all about it, and you get more customers. So you might actually make a good living from having a small alpha. You're a bit less secure, but you're totally getting more customers, up until, of course, your competitor does the same thing. So now you have this problem of, are you going to lower your prices? Because now, if there is a big disaster, let's say like a big fire in Los Angeles, suddenly there is a lot of outlays at the same time, and the entire industry might find itself in trouble. In the best possible world, there are some senior accountant or actuary who realizes that, we're putting the limit over here because we know this and we have this risk appetite. But there's always that temptation. And I think this is going on all levels, whether that's insurance or setting up teams at a company.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the financial crisis back in 2008 is a good example of that as well. Like, you know, the way we sort of set up these mortgages and create like synthetic CDOs and all of these like fancy products. Okay, the rating agencies will actually still give us, you know, good ratings for these products, even though they're shit, and someone is realizing that, and all of a sudden all other actors in the market have to do the same thing because you make a lot of money from doing it. And there might be some sort of accountants that point out that this is actually a bad idea, but they easily get shut down because after all, we're making so much money here. So please don't stand in the way for our success. And then just something happens and it creates sort of this trickle effect, and the big crash is a fact, and you can see like that pattern over and over again in Wall Street. You can see it in grading in schools, where there's sort of inflation, because giving higher grades means that you will get more students, and it means that you might get more money from the state or something like that, or you might even have in some school districts teachers that are being compensated based on the grades, and then obviously you want to give higher grades to the students, and then there might be that annoying teacher in the teacher's lounge that gives everyone low grades, and they're like, but you're preventing us from getting higher wages here, and then they get a little bit frozen out until it's all exposed and keeps crashing down.
I don't know if it's a little bit controversial to bring up at this time, but there is a race dynamic happening in AI at the moment, and it seems pretty obvious.
Oh yeah. I think it's a great example.
Yeah,
I think Kristian is
agree.
also eager on this. I mean, who haven't got an opinion on AI right now?
Yeah.
Not even the AI is staying out of it. Now, I think the cool part here is that you can imagine that in the old days, being an AI company, you had a product that might not work and nobody really wanted. So there was no problem except getting paid. And then neural networks started taking off. You could start getting good results. Indeed, they started looking very promising, so people started throwing money at you. It would be very stupid if you were a postdoc in artificial intelligence not to start a company, because, you would get a lot of better research funding than you would get at your university. So first of all, a lot of bright people moved out of academia and into various businesses. But then the next problem happens. AI actually started taking off really well. We are in the era of ChatGPT. And at that point, if you have a leading company, you get way more money and attention. And you might also think that actually some of the other companies and the other governments, they're kind of scary. You don't like them, not just because we're not competitive, but they haven't got your values. You might actually think that maybe there is a chance that I might be the one triggering the technological singularity, which means that I get to imprint my values on the long-term future. Even if I don't think my values are the best ever or anything like that, because I'm a very humble man, I realize that I definitely don't want those other non-humble guys. So I should probably get there first. But I might, of course, want to have a lot of safety. And you have some safety too in your companies. But if you realize that I'm kind of spending a lot on safety, if you skimp a little bit on safety, now you are going to advance faster. This is great for you. So I will probably have to skimp on my safety, because I better get to that holy grail before you. And maybe a skeptic is standing outside and saying, I don't believe that talk about technological singularity, but I do notice that you're skimping on security because you want to get there as fast as possible, and people keep throwing money at you because you're doing it anyway. So in this case, we have a race dynamic that gets very short-sighted about a technology that is probably the most world-changing technology we're going to get this century, or maybe even this millennium.
Yeah, DeepSeek has just appeared out of nowhere for many people, and then now all these other Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, they're all thinking, oh no, geez, I better put my pedal to metal.
Yeah, and I mean, they were already doing so to some extent before DeepSeek, and that was like rivalry between the three of those labs. And it's interesting, and I mean, I remember working when I was working at the FHI together with you and Nick, and Nick just released Superintelligence, and I remember sort of the conversations that started. And I mean, the fact is that a lot of these labs were created in the first place by people who actually care about safety. I mean, they care about existential risks from artificial intelligence. and they wanted to pursue that technology ethically, because there is a certain level of inevitability. At some point it will happen, and then you better sort of get there first and sort of apply an ethical approach to doing so. I mean, that was sort of more or less the foundation of both DeepMind and OpenAI and Anthropic as well. But I think a great example is in the past 1 to 2 years we have had a lot of open letters. Max and the FLI, who both me and Anders knows, a fellow Swede, they had like this letter on a moratorium, a 6 months pause for AI. And it's interesting because none of the CEOs from the big labs signed that. But at the same time, there was this other open letter from the Center for AI Safety, like a great letter, by the way, that said, okay, AI is an existential risk similar to nukes and pandemics, and they all signed on to that letter saying that this is an existential risk, but they did not sign the letter like we should probably pause the thing that is creating the existential risk, and this is all due to arms race dynamics, obviously, because I mean, if we pause, the other lab might race ahead, or China might race ahead, and all of a sudden a dictatorship has access to the most instrumental technology ever before any democratic states have access to it. So it is this very sort of hard dilemma, and I mean, I think that all of the CEOs and the leadership for the big labs, I think most of them have like really sort of good intents, but it's a tough spot to be in, because telling your investors and everyone else like we're just gonna pause this and let somebody else win is not really an option. So the only option is to, okay, let's have a little bit less safety so we can run a little bit faster, and then so
trade off in a little bit of safety now so we can get the decisive strategic advantage to then implement full safety in the hope that nobody else gets there first, right?
Yes.
Is there any areas where cooperative dynamics have worked in the AI arms race so far, or alongside the AI arms race so far between these big labs at OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, and other places as well? Have you noticed any good cooperative dynamics working?
I think there are some. I mean, there is a lot of the labs. I mean, they're in San Francisco, they're in the same places, the same conferences, the people who work for the labs, they sort of meet and hang out, and a lot of them are sort of aware of the arms race dynamics and concerned about them. So I think there is this sort of social relationships. But then there's also things like sort of responsible scaling policies, for instance. There has been, to some extent, a bit of a sort of race to the top in some ways between the labs, just saying that, okay, under which conditions would we, do like different things, essentially, like how do we scale this technology responsibly. And I'm not sure if it was Anthropic that sort of released their policy first, and then a lot of the other labs followed as a result. So I think there are sort of pockets of cooperative dynamics here, but in the end I don't think this is something that you can sort of leave to the market in a sense. I think you need government intervention, and you need government intervention in a way that is actually global. And I guess like an example of that is the latest rules from the BIS and the US government on their AI diffusion framework, essentially like having a view of who gets access to like AI model weights, but also who gets access to the hardware and GPUs that are sort of needed to train those chips. So those are sort of just some examples, but I'm curious if you have any examples as well, Anders.
So I'm thinking about open source software. So this is the opposite side of it. This is a cooperative dynamics that in some sense is undermining the AI safety world, because open source means that it's very hard to contain the AI. So DeepSeek R1 really took the world with like a storm wind. I have it running on my computer over here. It's very fun to be able to have something close to the cutting edge, even running on my own little computer. Which also means that now it's under my control. I can start trying to use it for whatever I want to. Oh dear. If I can come up with some naughty uses for it, then so can a lot of other people. At the same time, of course, one of the deep ideas of open source is if everybody can look at the code, it's actually the bugs are shallow. We cooperatively work together to solve programming problems. And this has worked really well in the past in the open source movement. To build fantastic software like Linux has helped develop many forms of freedom that are absolutely necessary for the world. The problem might be that AI could be a bit different. It might be that we don't want to open source the ability to make weapons of mass destruction, and it might very well be that AI could be akin to that. At the same time, of course, most open source people, immediately, as soon as you start talking about central control of a code, they get a reflex reaction and no, we have seen that before. All those authoritarian governments or the content industry trying to lock us in. So they very spontaneously moved on to the side of whoever wanted to spread the models. Indeed, when Meta said that they were open sourcing the models, they immediately got an unpaid lobbying group of open source programmers very loudly proclaiming that they were the best and all the other companies were the worst. Even though Lawrence Lessig, the famous advocate for open source, pointed out that actually by our own standards open source, we're only getting a big chunk of neural network weights. We're actually not getting the tools to manipulate it particularly well. This is actually not really open source. But it's interesting how easy we were taken in. And that, of course, goes to one of the important aspects that evolution have given us as a species. We're a cooperative species. We immediately like forming groups and working together, at least with people we think are like us. And we're also very good at being like each other because we copy each other, whether that is in terms of gestures or language and styles. And we immediately form little groups and think that our group is the best just because, and that other group is slightly worse than us because it's not our group. And before you know it, you have a lot of very crazy social dynamics that is, of course, totally reasonable if you have small tribal Stone Age people groups, but maybe not the ideal thing for judging how to handle a super intelligent software.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, most people would agree that some things you don't want to open source. Like you wouldn't want to open source step-by-step instructions for how to do nukes, and most people would agree that you don't want to open source like how to produce like various types of guns and so on. Obviously there is sort of exceptions to that. I mean, there is a whole movement around, okay, we need to 3D print our own guns, etc. And then you can obviously sort of disagree, like at what level of danger should you not open source something and sort of keep the technology under centralized control. And most people at least are somewhere on the spectrum. I mean, it's very few people that are saying absolutely everything in the world should be 100% open source. So it's more a matter of like how dangerous do we think that the technology will be. So I think like open sourcing in AI can be a great idea if it's like very sort of specific tool-like AI that are exceeding in a domain that is like non-dual use, meaning that, okay, if you use this AI for this specific thing, it will more or less only be good, right? I mean, I wouldn't mind open sourcing like an operating system for a self-driving car, for instance. There might be dual use cases I haven't thought about, but having a really, really good operating system for cars and having that open source where the community can sort of check it and safety test it would be absolutely great. But if you have sort of a AI model that is super intelligent, that it can sort of give you step by step how to create the next pandemic that is as deadly as rabies and has the incubation period of hepatitis B, which is like 10 months, and then it's as viral as the common cold, then okay, that's probably something that we should put under wraps.
But here again we have this Darwinian trap situation, because we want those open sourced operating systems for cars. We want those tool AIs, and so many of these systems, well, a little bit of improvement seems totally reasonable. Indeed, when you research AI, it's not clear at all what it would be good for. It's worth remembering that the large language models were to a large degree a surprise. People have been doing text prediction since the 1950s actually, but none of that was doing anything particularly interesting until recently, when it turns out that if you have a sufficiently big generative model, train it on sufficiently large data, sufficiently long, it's not just that it predicts text really well, it predicts ideas and thoughts in text. It started with relatively simple things like you could make ChatGPT-2 to play chess very badly. ChatGPT-3 could actually play chess somewhat reasonable and didn't break the rules all the time. And later on, it's actually a not too bad chess player, although it's not as good as a dedicated chess AI. Suddenly you're getting these mental abilities for free, and that was a surprise. So we might have this Darwinian dynamics now between different technologies we're selecting for the utility and coolness and maybe money-making capacity, that move us inexorably towards more general, more powerful systems, which of course means that we're getting bigger and bigger risks from them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's almost like we need to, I mean, the alignment problem, like the technical alignment problem, is hard as it is, right? I mean, building a model that is like proven to be safe and beneficial for humanity, it's incredibly hard, but it's almost like we need to solve the civilization and societal alignment problem as well, because it's not necessarily the case that the most aligned AI model will be the model that the market chooses. If you're a big enterprise, do you want to get the hippie AI model that care about all well-being for all humans, or do you want to have the AI model that maximizes profit for you? Arguably, you should be fired as a CEO if you don't have the profit maximizing model, because then you're not sort of fulfilling your duties to deliver the most return of investment to your shareholders. And similarly, if you're Ukraine or Russia or Israel, and you want to deploy your AI model, do you want it to sort of follow all sort of human rights? No, maybe not. I mean, they're currently not doing that, all of them, because they know that in order to win a war, you need to sacrifice human rights and other things, and sort of the list goes on. Like, if you're a politician, do you want an AI that is the most ethical, or do you want an AI that can sort of help you spread narratives that will make you maximize the chances of winning the next election? So it is like we need to take into account sort of the incentive structures in which we deploy the artificial intelligence in the first place. And that's indeed a very hard problem. So in some ways it makes things worse, like acknowledging that solving the technical alignment problem might not be enough. I mean, it could also be enough if we sort of do it and that, intelligence engaged in some recursive self-improvement and sort of overpowers everyone else, and spreads a lot of love in the world. I mean, there could be such a scenario as well. But if you believe in sort of slower AI evolution, we need to solve the civilizational alignment problem as well.
Which might actually be a kind of similar problem to the technical alignment problem. What we want to achieve in AI alignment is basically we want artificial intelligence systems that do what we want them to do, and maybe even do what we should want them to do if we could think through all the consequences really well and had the super intelligence and time, etc. This is already a bit badly defined. There are critics of the term alignment that rightly point out that actually you might want to split it into subparts. But the general problem is we have a complex adaptive system that can optimize things and change the world, and we're worried about its objectives. This, of course, goes for critiques of the market. So I remember having a conversation with the late Peter Eckersley over in San Francisco about this question. And we started the AI Objectives Institute just because of this similarity. Actually, companies and markets are a kind of artificial intelligence that come about not because of normal software, but in a collective intelligence and pieces of paper. And maybe there are some solutions for keeping them working in a good way that we could apply to AI. And vice versa, AI might actually, the technical solutions might be interesting to apply to companies. And of course, we have states, which are some of the most powerful artificial systems we have on this planet, and unfortunately also one of the deadliest. So far, the number of people who have been killed by AI is a handful. But the number of people killed by states, oh dear, that's a dreadful litany, and that's a very large number. And getting bad governance can be quite deadly. So we better figure out ways of doing this alignment. Now, one of the interesting things is that everybody can talk about wanting to have alignment, and yet we don't get it. Just because we're desiring something doesn't mean we get it, which an economist would say, oh, obvious market failure. We need to set up the market to align the incentives, and then the creativity of the market will somehow solve it. That's the kind of bottom-up solution. You have the right incentives, individuals try various solutions, and you evolve a solution that might actually converge to a useful thing. Sometimes you want to have a top-down solution when it's about, let's say, a device that if you activate it turns Earth into a black hole. You probably don't want to have a distributed solution where everybody has access to that device. You probably want to lock it up somewhere far away and keep it under very careful lock and key. So top-down solutions work well when the downsides are really, really tremendous and you can exert top-down control. This is why it's relatively doable to control nuclear weapons. Very finicky technologies that require very special ingredients, and you need to maintain them and use big factories to make them. This is why it's much more scary with biotechnology, because biolabs are much smaller. And it's really hard to control people's ability to make hacking tools and computer viruses. AI right now is slightly on the nuclear side because we need big data centers with a lot of compute to train it. Although we shouldn't bet on that. After all, a baby managed to learn the same things as a large language model a bit more slowly. Not much more slowly, but using much, much less data and much less energy. So there might very well be algorithms out there that, were we to find them, suddenly you could make something like ChatGPT using a few computers instead. But right now, they seem to be a bit more top-down controllable, at least for the training. The usage, on the other hand, that's tricky.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, there's a lot of people out there we can point the finger out and saying, hey, you're causing the AI arms race dynamic to speed up. But I think somebody said, was it Ice-T or was it Joseph Stalin who said, don't hate the player, hate the game. So, and as such, there's like it's the system, it's it's the competitive dynamics, it's Moloch. So, I just would want to table the idea of multipolar traps. If you want to discuss the idea that we shouldn't be pointing our fingers necessarily at individuals, although it's very easy to do, and I'm sure some individuals are bad eggs, and there's plenty of bad eggs out there, but what created those bad eggs?
Yeah, so I mean, in the book, I sort of called the phenomenon. I mean, it's sometimes called Moloch. It's sometimes called multipolar traps or tragedy of the commons type problems. And in my book, I choose to call them like Darwinian demons. I'm using the metaphor, of natural selection. So I essentially define it as a selection pressure. That makes it adaptive to behave in a way that is essentially destructive for everyone else that is playing the game. And like what makes that into a trap is essentially the game theory involved. I mean, there's this classical example in game theory but also in sort of like conservation and environmentalism called the tragedy of the commons. So I mean, imagine that you have sort of this commons. It could, for instance, be like fish in the Baltic Sea, and if everyone sort of follows some sort of quota, then the fish will be able to replenish, and there will be enough fish for everyone. But it might be adaptive for a particular fishing company to fish like a little bit more, because then they can sell more and have bigger profits and so on. But then the other fishing companies will sort of have to do the same, and then all of a sudden it becomes unsustainable, and there is not enough fish to go around, and the fish can't replenish because we fish too much of them, and then all of the fishing companies go bankrupt. And I mean, the problem here is that the dominant strategy is essentially to defect instead of cooperate. So it's like rational to actually defect and to fish more, because if you don't do it, you can count on someone else doing it. So that means that it becomes sort of this trap that is incredibly hard to escape, essentially.
And the way out of that trap is, of course, to change the game. So Garrett Hardin, who proposed this term in a very famous essay, he pointed out, for example, property rights is one solution. If you actually own the property, then people would tend to care for it. Now that doesn't work very well for fish, because they insist on just swimming around, not caring about who they actually should belong to. But Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize a few years back, she pointed out that actually quite a lot of society do solve problems like this. So those commons in England that Hardin was talking about, actually a lot of them were not overgrazed, because the locals saw the problem and actually figure out solutions. And indeed, in most societies, quite a lot of these commons problems are solved all the time, quite often using really weird institutions. So you might come to a village and find that they have various ceremonies, and it's very important that a particular family may only fish on Tuesdays. And nobody can really give you a great explanation of why. But the effect is, of course, that, well, if different families have different days to fish on, etc., you actually can smooth out things. You can actually create incentives that actually solve it. So you have changed the game without necessarily changing the players. There's still as greedy fishermen around, but now it's much trickier for them to overfish. Now, the interesting problem is, of course, how we get these solutions. So there are many people say, oh yes, I totally know how we can set up a government and laws and organize society for that. And many of them then go on in building big castles in the air about a perfectly organized society, maybe with a planned economy or something, which sometimes work, but quite often is a total disaster, because it actually doesn't solve the game theory in the village. Instead, it typically crashes the local game theory, because now the inspector from the government shows up and starts allocating quotas, because that makes total sense if you're over in the government building in the capital, but the local dynamics actually need to be fine-tuned. on the other hand, if you have a market, if the market is set up with the right incentives, now it stabilizes stuff. But if it's the wrong incentives, now it destabilizes stuff. And knowing the difference is not trivial at all.
Definitely. And I think, going back to artificial intelligence again, like I think a lot of these systems can adapt to be cooperative over time through various types of mechanisms, everything from, kinship to like indirect reciprocity, direct reciprocity, or multi-level selection, for instance. I mean, there are these identified mechanisms for cooperation to evolve over time. But it all requires like trial and error. And for some technologies, it might be so unfortunate that you don't get many trial and errors whatsoever. So there is sort of this debate in artificial intelligence, like, will there be so-called quote-unquote warning shots where we can essentially adapt and become more cooperative, create, international treaties because we realize after those warning shots that this is super dangerous? Or will it be one of those situations where, okay, if we reach super intelligence, it will be super recursively self-improvement and it just sort of grows and overpower us really, really quickly, and we're dead without much warning at all. And I don't know which category AI will fall into yet, but I'm curious what your thoughts are, Anders.
Yeah, a lot of it depends kind of, are we in a fragile world? Are there ways the world could crash? So Nick Bostrom has this fragile world hypothesis paper, which is really interesting and really annoying, which typically makes for a good philosophy paper, where he suggests that maybe there are technologies that if we get one of those, essentially unless we all coordinate really well, we're all dead. And it's an empirical question about the nature of the world. Maybe such technologies can't exist. The laws of physics don't allow them. The most destructive thing one can ever build is a nuclear weapon. Maybe we live in that world, but we don't know. And I think most of us would suspect that given that superintelligence looks like it could be pretty powerful in changing the world in very dangerous ways, and that self-replicating processes can grow exponentially, etc. Even if there are no technologies that blows things up tremendously big, there are probably other kinds of dangers like that. But it might also be that developing them is a softer process. You get warning shots. You are likely, if you don't have perfectly aligned AI, to have some of the robots go haywire in a way that makes everybody say, okay, never again. We're totally not going to do that stupid thing. But again, there have been plenty of disasters in human history where people have said never again, and only a few of them led us to actually fix stuff. Sometimes it works. So the flooding in the Netherlands, for example, led them to realize, okay, we need to really shore up our infrastructure, make sure that we can resist really big storms with really high tides, etc. The aftermath of the Second World War got Europe together to actually think that we should probably try to set up a system to make it less likely that we have a third war like this, and we ended up with the European Union, which for all its faults is actually quite good at making everybody work together. Mostly because the bureaucracy of handling a war inside the EU would be horrendous. Nobody wants to file the paperwork for that. So we might have a situation where there is hope. We just don't know. And generally in that situation we should just assume the worst and then try to do something about it. Although always assuming the worst, that the world is fragile, doesn't help you very much, because then you're just going to think you're doomed and probably better off going to the pub and just drink away your sorrows. It's better to assume that, yep, we have a selection bias. We come from a long line of cooperative organisms because the organisms that failed at cooperating, they went extinct. We have a lot of survivorship bias, but we also have a lot of clever tools for surviving. And we're not that stupid. We can actually come up with new kinds of institutions too. And I think that might be the way of handling this. So I'm somewhat optimistic about AI alignment and AI safety. I think it's not that bad. Now, I also have an optimism bias, so don't take my word as actually useful advice. But I am somewhat hopeful that there are ways around this. Then again, they might not be particularly neat. I remember having long-running arguments with Eliezer Yudkowsky going back to the 90s about what it took to make safe AI. And he always wanted to have some mathematical proof that this is a safe AI and it can unfold into a superintelligence and it will still stay sane and well-behaved. That line of inquiry eventually failed. It turns out that it's very hard to prove anything like that. It might be that just random bit errors could anyway wreck it. My approach was always Swiss cheese security. You have many layers that fix things. And this is how we generally get through life in our big human society without getting killed. We have a bit of evolved compassion and the tendency to cooperate. Our mothers also tell us to behave ourselves. So we get told a lot of rules of politeness and, good behavior. We also have reputations to uphold. And there is police. And so on and so on. So we have many layers, all of them imperfect. But that is why we're pretty law-abiding. This is why I'm not too worried when I'm standing at the bus stop that some of my fellow passengers might be having a bad day and want to push me in front of a bus. It does happen from time to time in the world, but it's super rare given the number of people with bad days.
You bring up the fragility of life hypothesis in your book.
It's inspired by Nick's vulnerable world hypothesis that Anders mentioned earlier, and essentially the line of thinking that I have, and there is various pieces of evidence that I believe points in that direction, but it's essentially, it's not just technologies that makes the world fragile, it's sort of life itself through natural selection. And so I essentially extend Nick's argument to any type of mutation, because you could see any type of mutation as some sort of biological technology, and it could be the development of viruses or predation or cancerogenic cancerous cells and so on. They're all sort of new technologies for survival that has been selected for. And I think, there is sort of this Gaia hypothesis out there that, the world and planet Earth is this like perfect system that always finds balance and harmony, and we humans come in there and disrupt that harmony. And I don't believe that is true. Like, I think there is actually a lot of instances in our evolutionary history that could have led to our demise. So imagine, for instance, before the Cambrian explosion, before the life was fully diversified, you could imagine some sort of super virus destroying more or less all life. And it's sort of interesting because, cells obviously have immune systems against viruses because of the, sort of Cas9 CRISPR mechanism, where you can sort of cut off those types of gene sequences and you reach some sort of immunity. But that technology had to be sort of developed and there might not be the case that in all worlds that technology gets developed in time before the super virus appears, and so I think there might be sort of a situation of survivorship bias where, like, throughout evolutionary history there is various types of mutations that might have killed us, but the reason why we're not dead is because obviously we cannot find ourselves in a part of the universe where we are dead. We must by 100% probability find ourselves in a corner of the universe that sort of enables our own existence, and planet Earth is just one data point. So I think the evidence towards like the fragility of life is, first of all, like these types of anecdotes. It's easy to find them. Like it's easy to sort of think of instances that could have led to our extinction in the past. But there are also in the fossil record like several mass extinctions that were caused by, algae or bacteria rapidly multiplying and causing climate change as a result. And sort of similar to how us humans are rapidly growing and spreading out through planet Earth and causing climate change. But I think what gives me hope here is that unlike the bacteria that caused previous mass extinctions, us humans, we actually are gifted with a large brain where we can sort of predict the future consequences of our behavior. So I mean, we're not just victims to sort of evolutionary hard-coded circumstances. We can, through our thinking and rationality, go beyond sort of our initial Darwinian drives and sort of think about, okay, is releasing all of those carbon emissions really smart idea? Is building more and more nukes a smart idea, or should we actually cut down on our nuclear stockpiles? We can sort of make those decisions. So I would argue for that reason that humans is sort of almost the only way for life to save itself. And I think the reason why we don't see visits from aliens or signals from aliens, despite having sort of scanned the night sky for such signals for several decades, is that in all of those other corners, life might have either destroyed itself, or like some sort of competitive dynamics might have prevented, like major evolutionary transitions to occur. So for instance, in most universes, there might not be sort of, an immune system against cancer. So cancer might be one of those things that stand in the way for like multicellular organisms, for instance. And it's just like very rare and very unlikely that these mechanisms will develop, and we happen to be in that lucky part of the universe where it actually did develop.
Survivorship bias. What do you think, Anders?
Yeah, the fragile, the life hypothesis, it's very much Peter Ward's Medea hypothesis taking up another notch. So Peter Ward coined the Medea hypothesis as a kind of contrast to Gaia. Gaia is usually depicted as a loving mother, but Medea, she killed her children and ran off. She was not a particularly good mother, even by the standards of Greek mythology. And he lists various mass extinctions that look like they might have been caused by life. I'm not entirely certain I trust that the biosphere itself might go extinct because of stupid stuff cells do. I think that's unlikely. I think it's a bit too robust about that. I have an unpublished paper that I need to return to at some point, where I tried to do some statistics to kind of balance the observer selection bias. But I think it's pretty obvious that the world could be way more unstable than we think, simply because of this observer selection effect. But it also is a very interesting point Kristian makes about we have the ability to do foresight. We can plan ahead and much better than other species can. Termites are really bad at climate management. They might be able to manage the climate inside the termite mound, but that's it. They don't care about their methane emissions, and they don't have any way of actually managing the climate change in the large. So we can see it. We might still be a bit too bad at coordinating against many of the bad things we're doing, but we still have some options, including we might say, this is totally going out of hand. We're totally building an underground bunker or going off to space or doing something else. It's not just that we can try to undo damage and prevent damage. We can also sometimes circumvent it or find ways of enduring the damage in clever ways. If we knew that a big asteroid would hit Earth in 100 years' time, we would totally build our arcs to save biodiversity and so on. There might still be a fair bit of argument about who goes into the arcs and how to set it up, but we could do it. Indeed, over 100 years, if we really had a strong incentive, it's pretty clear that we would probably come up with quite a lot of stuff, including, of course, probably at least a few attempts of deflecting that asteroid. So I think our brains are a real advantage here. We're causing a lot of trouble with the brains, but we're also able to solve these problems because we can understand game theory. Now we can understand game theory. It's worth noticing that this is a discovery that's less than 100 years old. People have certainly had this intuitive understanding. I've been reading some of Ada Palmer's work on the Renaissance recently, and there is so much amazing and horrifying and hilarious politics going on among people who are really born politicians. But they didn't have a way of formulating that. They got the first threads from Machiavelli, and later sociologists and historians started outlining a theory. Now we have much better ideas. We're still pretty lousy at taking sensible political precautions. We can point at our favorite political mishaps in various countries, but we're much better now than we used to be. And we're getting better at coordinating too. We even know that, okay, for this kind of job, we need an intergovernmental organization. For that kind of job, a standard. This one, we need to set up a market. Here, it might just be that we need a global ban for something. Get the diplomats to try to convince the UN Security Council about it.
Yeah. I want to respond to what you said earlier, Anders, on, it's not necessarily that sort of life destroys itself. And I think you might be right about that. Some aspects of life might be sort of resilient, but I think one other way that like defector and sort of these Darwinian competitive dynamics can prevent sort of more advanced life or intelligent life, such as ourselves, from happening. It could be sort of preventing major evolutionary transitions from happening in the first place. And part of my book is actually quite inspired by a paper that you put out together with Andrew and Eric and Michael on the timing of evolutionary transitions. And there might be sort of these hard steps in evolution, going from single cell to multi-cells, or to sort of create the first metabolism and something like that. And one of the things that I sort of highlight in the book is that some of these transitions might be hard because of these like competitive dynamics. So one example that I think is quite striking is what is called Spiegelman's monster, which is the observation that short sort of strands of RNA, so sort of imagine a RNA world with RNA molecules that are sort of replicating, but these short strands of RNA will actually replicate a lot faster. But they have the disadvantage of not being able to encode any useful information, and it might be just incredibly hard to sort of get out of this sort of competitive molecular dynamic. And similarly, if you have sort of groups of cells that clump together and cooperate in some way, it might be super strong incentives for one of those cells to defect and sort of do their own thing. So I think the fragility of life doesn't necessarily entail that all life is fragile, but I think it could entail something weaker, namely that sort of multiple layers of cooperation, everything from cooperating molecules to cells to societies, might be a bit fragile. So it requires a lot of sort of hard innovations to reach that level of cooperation. And I'm curious if you would agree with that, or
Yeah, so the major transitions in evolution, it's the name of a classic book about evolutionary biology by John Maynard Smith and Jörg Satmahari. I can't pronounce his last name. But anyway, one of the key ideas there is most of these transitions happen when smaller entities come together. You get cells. You take prokaryotes, put them together, and you get the eukaryotic cell. You get multicellular life. You get sexual reproduction. You basically change the information processing going on in life, and you create more complex systems that use more subsystems. And these subsystems, in some sense, lose their independence. So my mitochondria, they still got some DNA, but they can't reproduce outside my cells. They're kind of working like the local powerhouses of a cell, but they're part of a team now. And they can't leave. In some sense, I guess a free-living wild bacterium would say, what happened to those guys? They're enslaved by that big, weird collective. But my mitochondria might be actually saying, haha, we're part of a collective that has invented fast food. I'm getting so much nutrients. This is going really well for me. And the interesting question is whether we humans are not doing exactly the same thing. We used to be in small family bands and tribes. Gradually, we invented ways of organizing ourselves into larger societies. In order to do that, we actually need to subsume a lot of our individual wills. We actually need to give up our autonomy in order to function well in a larger group. Usually by joining the various rules that get imposed on us. Sometimes we all democratically agree on it. Sometimes it's that if you want to work at this company or this university, you better follow the rules that got set up. And quite often that is a very good idea because you get so many advantages. But now we become the mitochondria inside our companies or states or other big organizations, which in some sense are superorganisms. But here we have this problem, of course. If you're having a big organization, some employees might be cancerous. They might actually be stealing company resources and using them to start their own companies or doing other stuff. So you want internal controls. Just like our immune system is looking for cells that are no longer playing for team body but doing their own selfish thing. Companies and states are also trying to actually make sure that you get the right coordination. And sometimes that goes badly wrong. Sometimes you have states that are tyrannical and authoritarian. Some companies are no fun places at all to work at and are doing things badly. But these are coordination problems. And we might perhaps solve them by doing even bigger coordination. Many countries have rules about how companies may treat the employees. We democratically set up governments that force agents that selfishly would want to behave differently to behave in actually fairly nice ways as seen by the voters. We even have constitutions to prevent democracies from going bad. This doesn't always work, heavens should know that, but we are inventing tools for doing these bigger kinds of coordination, and they might become more scalable. It's worth noting that AI might actually enable us to do all sorts of new things in policy making and setting up organizations that were simply not possible before.
Yeah, I like your optimism, Anders. I hope you're right. I think I sort of have, and I think this is survivorship bias again. Like we will always find ourselves in a part of the universe where like all steps of every major evolutionary transition looks somewhat easy. We will always find ourselves in a universe where that is the case, even though it might not be easy. So I mean, sort of look at, cells collaborating and creating like multicellular organisms. You had to invent a lot of ways where the body can sort of essentially police defection, and it might be the case that it might require a lot of hard steps or a lot of small steps that are like not adaptive in and of themselves, and they all have to sort of happen in sequence. So there might be some sort of almost stochastic tunneling to cooperative behavior that is enabling like major evolutionary transitions. So I don't know, like imagine a real police department here. in order to have a real police department, you might want the police to have, guns, they might need walkie-talkies, they might need cars, and you need all of those things in order for the police department to work. But adding each of those things might not be sort of adaptive on its own. Now I'm obviously sort of using a metaphor to apply to sort of phenomenon below, but I think it might be the case, or at least we should sort of update our probabilities in a direction where things might be a little bit more difficult than it seems. But I think the reason for optimism again is the fact that we can actually design these mechanisms. We don't just need to do them through trial and error, which might require some stochastic tunneling in the past. We can actually have a little bit of foresight and predictive power to sort of see, okay, we think that this might work because we have developed the mathematics of game theory and mechanism design to sort of see if it works or not.
Can we rewire the fitness landscape to make altruism more adaptive? Where do we go from here? You mentioned the great bootstrap in your book, Kristian. How do we solve the systemic issues that we're facing?
Yeah, so the idea of a great bootstrap, it's essentially like sort of replacing the more or less trial and error algorithm of natural selection. Obviously, you cannot fully replace it. It's always going to run there in the background. But instead of just trying a bunch of technologies and see what happens, we try to use more of our brains and more of prediction to see what might happen before we test something, if it turns out that the world is indeed fragile or vulnerable. So the idea of the great bootstrap is essentially, can we make it adaptive to think more about the future and think more about the far future? And this is a domain where I think both sort of top-down government regulation could be very useful, but also something that is a bit more distributed and bottom-up, like prediction markets, or a particular spin on prediction markets that I call reputational markets, where instead of making any type of prediction, you make predictions on various government policies or corporate policies or budgets or strategic plans, and you make the prediction in relation to if you believe it will sort of satisfy or fulfill any sort of intrinsic values that we have, and that might be the intrinsic value of optimizing happiness or freedom or whatever it might be. And I think it is possible, and I think it's something that we need to think about much more carefully. Like, how do we do better technology forecasting and forecasting in general?
Because we're doing these tools for maintaining the cohesion of society and solving hard coordination problems. And some of them are weird rules about who gets to fish on Tuesdays, and some of them are reputation markets. And even approximations can be quite powerful. So our reputations in a society are a very vague approximation of how sensible and good our views are, and sometimes extremely misleading. But they're also possible to calculate using the kind of mental hardware we got. We can also extend that mental hardware. We can actually have karma scores on the different sites depending on how well we behave and if people upvote or downvote us. We can actually build systems that are surprisingly good at doing this. And I think, again, we're slowly learning how to do this well. In many cases, early social media were really bad at it. And then people got annoyed and fixed those reasons. So now we have better methods. For example, one of my favorite examples is the Stack Exchange series of sites where you can upvote and downvote questions and answers to them. So if I ask a really good question, I get points. Yay! Yeah, it's kind of play money. It doesn't correspond to anything except that I can boast a little bit, and I get a few extra rights on the side. But if it's a stupid question, I get downvoted and lose points. However, in order to downvote, you also then need to lose points to do the downvote. So mostly people are motivated to upvote things they like rather than getting into these chains of downvoting each other. So if you tune that well, and this is by no means easy, you get a system that actually gets good questions to the top and bad questions disappear. We might see that in the future we're going to invent better and better tools like this. And I do think that building these markets and the systems of creating reputation chains that are also linked to reality rather than just what the people like about each other can be super powerful. We see fragments of that with quality assurance, although that is usually not measuring so much quality as measuring that people are following quality assurance rules and paying a lot to be certified for that. So it's mostly not getting exactly what we want. But I think we can figure out better systems to get around Goodhart's law that makes us set up a metric for something and then we start optimizing the metric and suddenly we lost track of what we actually wanted. And instead we're getting so much more of a metric. But again, we have a name for it now. A century ago, it didn't have a name. Some people knew about it, but now we know the concept. We can start designing around it. We just should hope that in a century in the future, we're still around, and now we're orders of magnitude better at doing this.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I wish I had more conversations with you, Anders, in the process of writing the book, because I think the examples that you're bringing up with Stack Overflow and those similar sites are just such a great example that I actually wish that I had in my book in the first place.
We need to work on a sequel.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I would love to do that, Anders.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The Darwinian Escape Room.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's actually a good title, because I feel like I spent so much time on sort of describing the problems, and then my publisher is like, you also need to talk about the solutions, and we only have 2 months left, and I'm like, okay. And actually I had more of a list, and I wanted things to be a little bit more comprehensive, because in the end of the day, I am quite hopeful. I'm maybe not as optimistic as you are, Anders, but I would consider myself an optimist. I think we're far from doomed.
Well, yeah, the payoff of getting this right is like really hard to overestimate. I mean, you get this right and, we have the cosmological endowment, so to speak, for us to sort of have fun with for trillions, hundreds of trillions of years. Let's just end on a positive note then. What kinds of things do you think could happen in the near, medium and long term if we do get the coordination problems right and we do sort of escape the Darwinian escape room?
So I think a couple of things could happen. So I think it is a little bit crazy if you look at prediction markets, for instance, that a lot of them are not being used for many useful things. I guess predicting the election could be useful, but it's mostly being used for like sort of quite mundane things. So I would love to build a little bit more of a community and see that there is a community around, like you can actually make money from making good predictions, and those predictions can actually sort of change the trajectory of the world and do like massive good in the world. So I don't feel like we have leveraged that to its full extent. I think we have built out like a lot of infrastructure around sort of scoring and metrics, everything from the financial industry and sort of your FICO scores or S&P scores, or like the latest iteration on sort of ESG scores. So it's interesting because a lot of financial institutions and big capital care about those scores. Unfortunately, a lot of those scores are very susceptible to Goodhart's law, because you could pay the scorer, which was sort of a bit the case in the 2008 crisis, to just give you a good score. And in ESG metrics, for instance. Like it's more a metric of how many policy documents do you have. Like it doesn't care that much about the outcome. It's, oh, you have a governance policy, you have a diversity, equity and inclusion policy, you have a climate policy, but who cares about the documents in and of themselves? Like it's sort of the outcome that you're after. So that's again where I think the market is sort of ripe for change, and something based on prediction markets, I think, could be something quite dynamic. So it's not down to like the static sort of belief of a particular expert, but it's something that is completely dynamic and changing over time. So I don't actually know if I answered your question fully, Adam, but I want to leave it over to Anders to answer as well.
So Adam wants to kind of near term, mid term, long term. So I get to do the long term, of course, which is
Awesome.
anyway
Yes,
where
of
I'm
course,
mostly
the
at
author of
home.
Grand Futures, you get to do that.
Yeah. I'm kind of trying to finish my book on Law, Liberty and Leviathan before Grand Futures. That one is closely linked to what we have been discussing. Because it's all about how do these social structures work, and how do we solve our coordination problem, and what happens when we get AI everywhere in this mechanism. And I think we have this second order alignment problem, making our institutions work well when we're full of AI. There is a third order alignment problem to get AI to behave well to other AI, which might also be a real headache. But I think if we get our act together, we are going to create ways of coordinating better. And it might very well be that we set up very powerful coordination mechanisms on the global scale. Global problems are things that we actually have good reasons to want to have perfect coordination for. And maybe that should not even be left in human hands. But on the personal scale, it's kind of bad if the AI super nanny shows up and tells you, no, you shouldn't eat that hamburger for lunch. Here is some salad, that's good for you. We would feel very bad. Indeed, having autonomy and a feeling of control over your own life is kind of essential to actually function as a human. So you probably want to limit also the amount of coordination, even if it would be much better for us to have salad for lunch. So you want to set up a particular structure for the AI supporting coordination. The good news is, of course, that most of us don't think of it as an infringement if the UN Security Council makes a sensible decision about nuclear weapons or other situations globally. That is far outside our area, and we're kind of quite often happy to hand it over to the bigger powers. But we want to safeguard our own lives and identity. I think getting that balance right is tricky, but I think it's doable. I think many societies have done pretty decent approximations of it. Some have failed at it and been absolute disasters, and I hope in the future we can make it harder to run an authoritarian society, harder to make a surveillance state. But that might require quite a lot of mid-level coordination. In the really long run, I'm hoping that we get to be those mitochondria kind of riding along in these superorganisms going out, settling the universe. And we're smugly thinking, oh yes, it's all for our purpose. And of course, these post-human superorganisms and civilization, very smugly thinking, oh yes, those small human mitochondria inside us, yeah, they're giving us a kind of consciousness and motivation and a lot of weird ideas. They're a very small but kind of necessary part. We can't live without them. Isn't that cute?
I love that, Anders. I was actually planning on going sort of in the same direction. I think my vision for like super intelligence is a vision where it's essentially a swarm of like AI tools that are solving cancer for us or a bunch of specific problems working together with us, and together we create this combined super intelligence. But that super intelligence is sort of, we are a part of it. We are like that mitochondria, or we are sort of like the cells are to our body. And I mean, I wouldn't dream about like killing my own cells. Unless it's cancer, though, then I would want to definitely get rid of it. But all non-cancerous cells, like, I want them to feel great, and I want them to enjoy the ride being a part of me. And similarly, I hope we will enjoy the ride being a part of a next generation super intelligence, and one that is not like a distinct thing from us, but where we are actually part of it.
Look, it's been amazing having you on the show. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to interact with you guys, and such a great book, Kristian. Anders, I'm really looking forward to your book, or both of your books.
Yeah.
The Leviathan one, I didn't quite catch the full name. What was it
It's
again?
Law, Liberty and Leviathan, or maybe it's Liberty, Law and Leviathan. My co-authors have been changing the title again. Tomorrow I'm having a meeting with them. I have a printout of it lying on the living room the table, and it's big.
Yeah. Oh,
Feel free to send it over, Anders.
I totally will. I'm going to spam everybody I know,
also.
and especially you.
Yeah,
I
please
really
spam us.
appreciate it, and thanks a lot for like reading my book and partaking in this recording, Anders. And yeah, I came from New Zealand recently, so I'm actually like super jet lagged. So I feel like I wasn't up with to sort of my full cognitive capacity, but
You did
hopefully
fine.
the listeners will still find it interesting, Adam.
Yeah, no, I'm sure they will. It's been really great, guys. Yes, so look, I'll close now, and thanks everybody for tuning in and watching or listening. If you like this, please share and subscribe. And thanks, and I'll see you soon.
See you in the future.
Yep.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.